Good morning. Will you pray with me, please? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you. In your name, amen. So next month is the 9th anniversary of my moving to the US from England. It seems both like forever ago and like yesterday. One of the most fascinating and eye-opening parts of living here has been seeing the lens and the stereotypes through which Americans view Brits. On the positive side, nobody ever once complimented my accent when I lived in England. Here, it happens all the time, except at drive-thrus. I've learned that my terrible attempt at a New England accent, which I'm not going to demonstrate right now, is more successful at getting Dunkin' Donuts than this. But there are negatives too. It seems that Americans universally agree that British food is the blandest, most taste-free cuisine in the world. I will admit that there may be some historic truth to this. Beans on toast, for example, it is the dish that my American friends cite as their reason why they think that Brits don't do food very well. And in fairness, I do remember my grandmother stubbornly declaring that lasagna was too exotic for her. But I don't think that that claim is fair, that Britain has no flavor in their food anymore. I've known many Americans who have been surprised, in fact, by just how flavorful British food can be. In fact, one such American is sitting right behind me. And I have a little... When Michelle and I were first married, we lived in England. One evening, less than a month after our wedding day, Michelle and I were winding down, watching TV together, when she had a hankering for a ham sandwich. Now, if you've ever been fortunate enough to have one of Michelle's sandwiches, you'll know that she is extremely generous with the fillings and seasonings, and this occasion was no exception. She used plenty of ham, a good inch-thick layer of butter, and almost half the jar of mustard. What Michelle didn't know is that the mustard she had eaten all her life in America was a much diluted version of English mustard. Michelle discovered this halfway through her first bite. When I realized what was happening, I did what I'm sure any kind, conscientious spouse would do in that situation. I filmed it. We don't have any sound, I don't think, but as you can see, she is, her nose is...
English mustard's not the same as American mustard, is it, Michelle?
Running down her cheeks. That I asked her, English mustard is not the same as American mustard, is it, Michelle? And so that's why she is shaking her head, and yes. So there we go. And I knew that video would come in handy someday. And I did feel a little guilty about using it until she pulled that trick with the salt. And the kids down here, that was really mean. But there is a point to me showing that video and telling that story, because as you've heard from Emily's reading, this morning's message is all about seasonings and specifically about salt. Our gospel reading comes from the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is kind of like Jesus' State of the Union address, only he's talking about the state of the unions, the relationships between God and us with one another. In the passage that Emily read to us, Jesus says to humanity, and that's God's people, that's all of us, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, anyone who has spent any time cooking in the kitchen will know what the purpose of salt is. Michelle talked about it in her children's conversation. Salt enhances and amplifies the natural flavor of the food that it is sprinkled on. That's the purpose of salt. And it's clear what Jesus is saying through this message. As people of God, it is our job to be the salt of the earth, to enhance and amplify Earth's delicious natural flavor. In other words, it is our job to see the good that is already in the world around us and has always been in the world around us and say, look at this. Isn't it good? In many ways, this is actually quite humbling for us. Jesus is telling us, and us being the church, you're not the main course. You're not the starter. You're not even that little chocolate mint that you get with the check at the end of a meal. You're the salt. All the food is already on the table. You are here to make sure that people realize just how good it is. And that's why Jesus follows this message about salt with a warning us that salt that has lost its taste is no longer good for anything. If we're convinced that the only goodness is to be found not here, not in the world, but somewhere else, we are not being salt of the earth. We are being salt of somewhere else. That's not what Jesus asks of us. Similarly, convincing ourselves that goodness is only really found here, within these four walls, is also not what Jesus asks of us. We've probably all experienced what happens when we oversalt a dish or add too much English mustard to a sandwich. The seasoning becomes so overpowering that the original flavor is lost. The ham sandwich becomes all about the mustard. God's goodness becomes all about the church. And that's not what Jesus asks of us. The good news is that Jesus does not burden the church with exclusive rights to the goodness of God. The good news is that the goodness of God is everywhere, because God is everywhere, and God's goodness cannot and will not be contained. God's goodness is the meal. In a moment, we will eat bread and drink grape juice, because God's goodness is the meal. As people who know God's goodness, we are called to be salt of the earth, to live lives that recognize God's goodness everywhere and say, look at this. Isn't it good? Thanks be to God. Amen.